In this slideshow, we're going to learn about some graphic design basics. Specifically, we're going to talk about the elements of design, some of the principles of design, what I call the thou shalt nots, or things you should not do in design, and we're going to discuss briefly illustration styles. The elements of design are essentially the tools in the toolbox of a graphic designer. And these tools are used to direct the eye. And that's a big part of graphic design, and we'll continue to talk about that throughout the slideshow, and probably others as well. The first element of graphic design is space. In design, empty space is called a white space, and it's a powerful tool to direct the eye. This famous ad for VW uses a large amount of white space. The viewer first looks at the vehicle and then is directed by the direction of that vehicle to the tagline, think small. And then if their interest is captured, they will go on to get more details about the car. In design, you want to be intentional about what is on the page or screen and avoid trying to emphasize too much. This applies to both design and photography. This poster is for the play Nest. The play is the story of Susanna Cox, an indentured servant who was accused of infanticide and was hanged by the state of Pennsylvania in 1809. There are basically two primary visual stops in this vast amount of space. So the eye is captured by the compelling picture of the presumably hanging person, and then the legs act as leading lines to direct the eye toward the title and the finer details about the play. And that brings us to the next element of design, which is line. The idea of leading lines is prominent in photography, but lines, whether blatant or implied, lead the eye to a specific point in graphic design as well. Graphic designers use leading lines to strategically guide the viewer's eye to specific places in a design. Shape is yet another element of a design, or a tool in the toolbox of graphic designers. Shapes can be organic, as in the left side, or inorganic, as in the image on the right. Organic design has been popular lately, influenced by the sustainability and environmentalism movements. Organic textures, shapes, and colors have become widely used across various elements of design. Inorganic shapes, also known as geometric shapes, refer to the types of shapes commonly seen and used in geometry. Things like circles, squares, triangles, rectangles, octagons, ovals, and so on. Geometric shapes that are used in graphic design can help stimulate logic, orderliness, and certain emotions. So size is an obvious design element that can be used to establish visual hierarchy. Here we look at the woman first. In addition, the three other figures appear to be further back in space, not only secondary in our viewing, but the size gives it a sense of depth. The gaze of the woman, in addition to the size, will direct the eye to the people in the background. Pattern is an element of design, and it tends to draw attention. It's also frequently used in supporting graphic elements, such as borders. Patterns are comprised of seamlessly repeating shapes, and they can also be organic or inorganic. And here are some of the patterns used in the University of South Carolina's branding system. You have probably seen these. Texture in graphic design adds an impression of depth and authenticity. Texture tends to make designs give the impression that a human hand was involved. Designs with texture generally look less sterile, or what I call computery. They look like maybe they were not designed on a computer because of the subtle texture. Now that we've discussed the elements of design, let's talk about some of the principles of design. So I'm going to begin with the CRAPP model that was popularized by the graphic designer named Robin Williams. Not the comedian, just a very famous author of graphic design. And yes, it's easy to remember because the acronym it spells CRAPP. The C is for contrast. Contrast is the design principle by which similar design items are distinctly different. So not only are things different, but they're very, very different. Contrast gets the attention of the viewer. It's a really important aspect of design. Contrast is very important for directing the eye of the viewer to prominent areas of a piece. According to Adobe, contrast is what happens when two design elements are in opposition to each other. This can be done with differing colors, sizes, thicknesses, patterns, textures, fonts, and anything that has a difference. So here we see an annual report cover and a couple of spreads within, and you can see some very drastically different design elements. Extremely different sizes of type, color. You can see a great amount of white space. You can see different typefaces as well. And here's another example of extreme contrast. So there are some things also to avoid when you are trying to create contrast in graphic design. And the big thing here is go big or go home. So if you want to create contrast, make things really, really, really different. So you don't want to contrast, for example, a sort of heavy line with a heavier line, or brown text with dark brown headlines, or using a couple of typefaces that are similar. The big thing with contrast is that you want to make it extreme. The R in the CRAPP model is for repetition, and it's kind of different. It kind of opposes the element of contrast, but they have to be balanced with each other. Repetition is the design principle in which visual elements are repeated throughout the pages of a publication or within an element itself. Even something like a logo can have repetition in it. Incorporating repetition into a design is going to strengthen the unity of that design. So where do you see repetition? For example, let's look at these two spreads here. I see repetition of shape, circles, color, primarily green and black. Also, these photos are both black and white, as are the screenshots here. I see repetition of illustration style as well. The recurrence of elements can make an idea more clear and also more memorable. Repetition builds consistency. It's more than just repeating something over and over and over. It adds a layer of continuity and creates a stronger composition overall. And yes, there are some things to avoid with repetition as well. You want to avoid repeating an element so much that it becomes annoying or overwhelming. So think about either interior design or maybe dressing. So you don't want to have all blue in your bedroom. Blue bedspread, blue carpet, blue paint, blue pillows. That's too much repetition. And at the same time, you might pair a red dress with a red pair of earrings, but you probably don't want to have also red shoes, a red hairband, red necklace, a red necklace, and so on. So that can be overwhelming and too much. So the same applies to graphic design. The A in the CRAPP model stands for alignment. Alignment is a design principle in which every design element has a visual connection to something else on the page. Nothing in graphic design is placed arbitrarily. So the information on this card is right aligned or flush right. We'll talk about that more when we get into typography. It has a strong and visible vertical line that has more of an impact than simply aligning all elements down the center. In design, there is no eyeballing or approximating. We use guides to make sure that the alignment is very, very precise. The P in the CRAPP model stands for proximity. The principle of proximity is simply the process of ensuring that related design elements are placed together. Any unrelated items should be spaced apart. Close proximity indicates that the items are connected in some way, or that they have a relationship to each other. So here's a very simple example that highlights a great use of proximity and white space. Take note of how the studio name, Type Studio, and its descriptive text, graphic design and art direction, are grouped together. This makes perfect sense because these three lines all have a connection to each other. The name of the business and what the business does. So then look at the second paragraph. This contains all of the contact information about the business. And here's an example of using the principle of proximity with both type and graphics. The type is well organized using relationships such as the name of the movie and the director. And in addition, note how most of the graphical elements are grouped together and positioned on the same side of the layout. What to avoid? Basically, we don't want too many visual stops on a page or a screen or a plane of some kind. So don't stick things in the corners and in the middle. So in this example, the eye has to make 5 visual stops. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And it's really difficult to know where to begin reading. It's confusing. Here we just have basically 2 visual stops and a graphic that gives us a leading line. So we have what the company is and the contact information. And in addition to the CRAPP model, there are a number of other principles of graphic design. For example, balance. And balance has both asymmetrical and symmetrical elements. Asymmetrical balance can be kind of difficult to achieve because objects are arranged differently on each side of an axis that goes down the middle. But a harmonious balance is still achieved. And this requires really careful placement of objects and consideration of their visual weight to achieve this balancing effect. Things like color, size, and position of each object needs to be carefully considered against other sides of the page to ensure that nice visual balance. Asymmetrical layouts tend to be more dynamic, more contemporary, and generally more interesting than symmetrical layouts. Symmetrical layouts tend to be similar on both the right and the left side of the page. So humans have an innate sense of balance, and if objects are not distributed evenly around a vertical axis, it makes us uncomfortable. So this is a symmetrical design because the side of the left and the right are more or less the same. Not exactly the same, there are some different letters and so on, but if we divided this in half, it would be roughly about the same. Creating connection under a unified theme pulls the whole concept together. Unity achieves overall harmony with the elements for a holistic and consistent composition. Now, unity is achieved by using all of the other principles of graphic design, such as balance, scale, contrast, repetition, movement, emphasis, and so on. In graphic design, rhythm refers to the relationship between elements in the piece and how they interact together. Rhythm usually occurs in one of a few ways. Attaining rhythm isn't easy, so designers create rhythm by building upon consistent elements to make something flow and move together. Rhythm and repetition are often closely associated with each other. With effective rhythm, you can guide the viewer's eyes through a piece in a very specific way, also known as visual hierarchy, and you can evoke specific feelings or change the way that we interact with a piece. Proportion happens when balance and proximity and unity all work together. It adds breathing room between sections of similar elements. The combination produces an orderly sequence of design parts. So we have talked about visual hierarchy and emphasis throughout this slideshow already, and others. A hierarchy creates structure. Designers construct a system of ranking, basically, according to priority for elements to define that visual hierarchy. It takes a combination of all of the design elements, but especially emphasis, which we will also talk about now. And emphasis is just another way of saying, make something stand out. So for example, if you were typing a page of text, to emphasize the headlines, you might style them in a bold or bigger text. Emphasis goes hand in hand with hierarchy. Emphasis also interrupts the rhythm of a design and draws attention to a focal point. The focal point is the main center of interest. So again, working with things like space and color and contrast and patterns can add prominence to viewpoints. Good hierarchy is clearly evident in this recipe spread. So a large photo of the dish is used as a focal point. It draws the eye. And the secondary message is the second largest shape on the page, which is the recipe name. And then color and size has been used to organize the remaining content in a clear, concise, and nicely structured manner. Important to graphic design is the idea that if you try to emphasize everything, you basically end up emphasizing nothing. You have to be really strategic in terms of what you want to emphasize. And you can do that through a number of strategies, contrast being a large one. So, large and small. Obviously, we see the large thing first. Thick versus thin. Serif versus sans serif. And we'll talk about those very soon in typography. Dark versus light. Color versus black, and so on. All right, and the next thing that we want to talk about in this slideshow are the thou shalt nots, as I call them, of design. So things that amateurs tend to do and professionals to not do. Amateurs tend to center everything. They always want to center at least the headline. Even as I create a PowerPoint or Keynote presentation, The default is centering. And I believe I've said this before, but the default is usually, almost always, not the solution in terms of graphic design. Centering tends to be very formal, very bland, I would say, and a little bit old-fashioned. And we'll talk about this more when we get to type, at least in terms of centering type. There's this thing called stair-stepping in graphic design that amateurs tend to do, where you kind of stagger design elements, whether it's type or other things. And this is something I'm not sure why it's the case. Here is a panel of a brochure that I had a student create a number of years ago, and they did that. They wanted to stagger everything instead of aligning things. So stair-stepping is an amateur error, or a thou shalt not. We have talked about space and white space and how it's a really good idea in design. It's a great tool to use in directing the eye. But trapped space is a whole different thing. And trapped space refers to space that appears between elements on a page or a spread or a screen. You usually want your space to be directed on the outside of the plane. So here we see trapped space here and here. It would be much better directed on the outside of the page. Again, space is good. Trapped space is not good. And here's an example I found with a great deal of trapped space here, here, and I'm sure you can pick out the other places where there is trapped space. Another amateur error in graphic design is what's called naked photos, not what you're thinking, and also warped photos. Naked photos refer to photos that kind of lack a border in one area. This is a mild example of naked, but see how the white sky blends in with a white background? You would usually want to use what's called a hairline border here to give a sense of this ending. And it's more severe if it's a whole corner. And warped photos refers to what you're seeing here, which is everybody looks like they've gotten a little skinnier. Everybody's squished, and it can go either way. You always want to maintain perfect proportion, whether it's a photo or a graphic. You don't want to squish anything. Bulky borders and boxes is an amateur error. We have a tendency, for whatever reason, to put things in boxes. And my theory is that you're trying to create some kind of separation of elements or a visual hierarchy by putting a box around everything. But there are better ways to do it, including all of the things that we've just discussed. By putting boxes around everything, you really inhibit the flow. And again, there's so many other better ways to create visual hierarchy and to create proximity where different things go together. And one of the last things that is an amateur error that I want to talk about is just filling up the corners and making things really cluttered. So not allowing for that nice white space. You don't have to fill up all of the space. White space is good. There is even a textbook that I use often called White Space is Not the Enemy. Okay, so here is a brochure layout that was created for the Public Relations major in the SJMC. And I don't want to point out everything for you, but you should be able to pick out a number of amateur errors here. I see centered text. I see a squished graphic, trapped space, and I want you to find some more. Okay, finally, I want to talk about illustration style. You do not have to be a good artist or great illustrator to be a good designer. The idea of design is not to mimic reality or to have some kind of an artistic vision, but instead you want to use the tools and the elements of graphic design to communicate a specific mood or a tone or a personality. You're trying to communicate something typically for a client. So all the following images are illustrations of people, but you're going to see that they're drastically different, and almost none of them are very realistic at all in terms of what people look like. This is a collage for the New York Times Sunday Styles column called Modern Love. And notice the line quality and the color and the paper quality, as well as the fill. What do you think that these things communicate visually? What are some of the adjectives that come to mind? To me, I guess it's kind of muted, it's thin, it's sparse, it's messy, it's kind of empty and uncertain. So I have a lot of other examples, and I'm not going to analyze every single one of them, but we'll go through some of these slowly, and I'll give you a chance to think about the mood and tone that's visually communicated and why. This illustration accompanied a story about Men's Fashion Week in Milan. Ali Barash is an illustrator who writes hilarious comics about things like her own struggles with anxiety and depression, and this is her illustration style. This piece went with an ad for a clinic that treats the emotional and physical needs of their patients. So, what does this illustration style communicate to you? Got messy, thin lines, different weights in the line, kind of unfinished. Here's an illustration that was used to promote a certain bookmaker. I don't know much else about it. And here's a 2010 piece, but it's definitely, it appears to be much older to me. So illustration style can definitely communicate nostalgia as well. And that's it for this short presentation on some of the principles and rules of do's and do nots of graphic design.